Good day.
Good day.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Today on the show, we are going to discuss the series Under the Bridge. It's a 2024 Hulu miniseries that dramatizes the true story of Reena Virk and her 1997 murder in British Columbia, Canada. It's an 8-episode series, and it's based on Rebecca Godfrey's 2005 best-selling book of the same name and was created by Quinn Shepherd. It stars Vritika, I think that's how you pronounce it, Gupta as Reena Virk, Lily Gladstone as Cam Bentland, and then a bunch of other really great actors. That's the way I'm going to go with that. There's a lot of really amazing young actors in this, so if for no other reason, that's a great reason to watch if you like any of the actors or actresses in this. It follows the events leading up to and after Reena's murder, which occurred when she was invited to a party under the Craigflower Bridge by a group of her peers, nicknamed the Shoreline Six. During the party, Reena was severely beaten and then killed by 2 of the group after she tried to escape. 7 teenage girls and 1 boy were eventually accused of the murder. What did you think of this series in general?
I really liked it. We found ourselves watching like 2 episodes at once, even though it was heavy, just because it really pulled me in. I thought the acting was fantastic. And Lily Gladstone, I just love. She's just so great. And she's so great in this role. But also just all of the girls. The girl that played Kelly Ellard was phenomenal. I mean, you just hated her. So
You did. Yeah, absolutely.
She played it like terrifyingly well. I found it pretty gripping. I mean, I think they did a really good job bringing back the 90s, if we're just like talking about the atmosphere, because the woman that they cast to play the writer was just like straight out of like a Winona Ryder singles movie.
Yeah, she had the flannel around her waist
and the
everything.
haircut and the whole thing.
Yeah, they did the whole thing.
But it was dark and it was effective. I think that's the way that I felt about it. It was very effective and it was very uncomfortable. And it really just, highlighted bullying and just how hard it is to be a kid in middle school, high school. I personally thought it was pretty effective.
I'm glad. I'm glad that it was an enjoyable watch. I had a similar experience. It was uncomfortable for a lot of it. And it wasn't just because it's really uncomfortable to watch that level of bullying. It was also uncomfortable to watch what the parents were going through.
Absolutely.
They weren't exactly the most likable characters in the beginning.
Right.
And you really saw in this, fictionalization, the parental teenage relationship wasn't going well, as it often does not. And there could be reactions in this series and the fictionalization of it, because obviously this isn't the absolute reality of what was happening. But, you could blame the parents for some of the things. You could blame the kiddo for some of the things. And we often, when we're at this level of bullying, blame the victim, blame the family, blame the parents, all those things are kind of happening in your mind just as a human who acknowledges not great thoughts and opinions sometimes. So you really go on that ride as you're watching it. And the first many episodes are really uncomfortable because these kids are kind of awful. They're really awful to her. And she's not helping the situation. You're like, no, you're doing that thing like you do in horror movies, kind of, where it's like, oh God, don't do that.
Right.
Oh, you're making it worse. Oh, stop. All of that stuff where we get very blame the victim type of mentality, because you just sort of see it coming. You kind of know the end of it because it's a true story. So it's uncomfortable on a lot of levels. I also found it kind of uncomfortable. And I'm going to get into this when we go through some of the differences between the real story and the Hulu series, which I always think is kind of interesting with this. I also found it uncomfortable because they made the author this main character that had a real issue with boundaries.
Oh my God.
And I was really uncomfortable at her characterization.
Yes.
And I was like, is this like the real person?
Because I know very uncomfortable.
Because I know the real person, the real writer, the real author was involved with this series and its development until her death in 2022. So I was like, oh God, did she really have this like close thing with this boy kid?
It was very.
I was like, ooh.
Yeah, they teetered into a romantic relationship.
They were kind of giving the vibes, weren't they?
And then it would be met with like a weird message that no, this was just about her trying to repair the loss of her brother. And I'm like, okay, listen.
That was all really fictionalized.
Two very different things going on here. And if you are wanting to repair something that's happened through
your own trauma,
creating a new experience, right? Repetition, compulsion, whatever, then it's about that. And she would have had more of a brotherly relationship with him, but she was attracted to him and he was attracted to her. And then they would switch, and it was implied, they never said that, but then they would switch it to where he was like kind of looking at her like a mother. And so then there was
and where she was protective of him.
It didn't work for me.
Like as if it was a brother thing. Yeah, that part of this series for me just was uncomfortable and not in an appropriate, not in a serving the story kind of way.
It felt very displaced, and it felt like it distracted.
I thought so too.
From what was going on. And I don't know, and maybe you read something. Was there an intention behind that, like ambivalence?
Well, so this is absolutely, I wanted to answer this question for myself, because when I watched it, I thought, well, okay, let me dig into the real story. Let me see what's going on. And then I kind of went down a rabbit hole of like, why did she really want to make herself the middle of this story? Because that's not a very journalistic thing to do. I'm okay for the ride of gray morality and all of that, but like, what is happening to? And to be clear, they never have them go past it. It's just a vibe you definitely get.
Yeah.
One of the questions I was asking, and it was answered in this Elle article that I found, is why is the author, Rebecca Godfrey, such a major character in Under the Bridge? Because I wasn't expecting that. The first couple episodes, fine, but she becomes like the hero. She's the main character of this series, which was off-putting to me.
Her name is Riley, I think it's Kef.
And she's been in some other stuff that is really amazing. So, okay. So the answer to this question from this article and from the horse's mouth, so to speak, is in her book, Godfrey rarely mentions herself, which I thought was really interesting. So in the original book, it's very different from the series in that way. Because when I was watching the series, I'm like, this must be because the book is like her memoir or something, and that's why she's such a major character. But this article is telling me that in the book, which I have not read, she rarely mentions herself. She is not a character in the story, let alone a major one.
I want to, sorry, real quickly, I think it's pronounced Keough. Riley Keough is her name. Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So go on.
As the author told this interviewer in 2019, I don't know if it was an issue of ego or an artistic choice, but either way, I didn't think my role as reporter was interesting or necessary. So this makes me feel better about the real story. I suppose I was also skittish about the parallels with my own life. I didn't want to talk about my brother's death or my own troubled adolescence in Victoria. So in the book, she really doesn't make it about herself, although this series does, right? So in the series, this storyline is a lead actress, and it's a significant amount of screen time is spent focusing specifically on Godfrey's role. This is what we're saying in the story, including her background as a kid, her real life brother drowning, all of this. So Shepard told Elle Godfrey helped the adaptation team develop the fictionalized TV Rebecca in order to make her into a dynamic leading character. So here's the thing. I guess they wanted this dynamic lead character to be her. Similarly, Shepard, who's the person that helmed this, she'd come up with the idea of fictionalizing Godfrey before she'd even had a chance to meet the author. The series creators shared that making Godfrey a character was integral to not only quote unquote exploring the book, but also to zoom out from it as the only definitive account of the crime. It sounds to me like it was just the director creators thing that, okay, this is how I'm going to zoom out of the murders and the bullying. In other words, it was the artifice where we can't just be following these bullies because it's too awful. We need some kind of macro story, right? If the kids are the micro story and the intimate part of the thing, we need a macro story to encapsulate
Sure.
it.
Makes sense.
And that's just what she chose. And
Okay.
I don't like it.
I don't like it either.
Cool. And also, we could add what happened to Rebecca's real life brother. Maybe that gives some context. In the Hulu series, she refers multiple times to her late brother Gabe and his tragic death. This is also pulled from reality. The real life Godfrey's brother was named Jonathan, and when he was 16, he fell from a bluff near the family's home and drowned. So that apparently is a real part of her story. And she talks about how she had a lot of difficult teenage experiences. She was 13 when that happened, and she kind of went into the punk scene. She got wild. She had a lot of anger. She had a lot of toughness. So I think they're taking that and putting that on the character, which is why the outfits and the smoking and the kind of gray morality that we pick up on, all of that stuff.
Interesting.
All right. So I wanted to answer that question for sure.
Thank you for doing that, because I was wondering the same thing.
Yeah. I was like, so that's our critique, of course, of the series as well, is that it's an interesting thing. I imagine it's a pretty good book if you're interested in that. But also, I just kind of need to know, like, what the hell? Also, interestingly enough, so to wrap this into some of the adult characters, Lily Gladstone's character, Cam, I thought you might be interested in this. Police officer Cam Bentland is one of the few entirely invented components in Under the Bridge.
She was kind of the narrator, right? She kind of helped give the story on screen.
Yeah, and she brings in the cultural aspect that they
Sure.
address too for that part of the world as well. Because in Canada, that's a much bigger story that we could go into. So that character's actually, so one of the criticisms is that that's a composite character representing multiple police sources Godfrey worked with during her reporting. So there was a bunch of different sources she used. And Cam is an Indigenous cop adopted by a white family, and her history with the TV Rebecca is a loaded one. So Gladstone felt the character's identity added a layer of nuance that the book itself had not addressed. The murder happened just by tribal land, and the bridge connects the municipality to a reserve. So inherently, there's a First Nations presence in the story. I thought it was a brilliant construction to have a First Nations adopted cop who feels compelled to Reena in that way. And I really loved that character. There were pieces of what that character did that were like, what? And that's where I got the composite thing, was because she's pretty congruent throughout the whole thing, and there's no doubt the actress is amazing. She was the lead in Killers of the Flower Moon or whatever that movie was.
She's fantastic.
She's amazing. She was the best part of that movie as well. There's a part where she all of a sudden decides that she's going to stick up for this one kid, literally give up her badge to stick up for this one kid and not have the kid prosecuted. Now, I was empathetic of most of the kids in many ways because it's a horrific thing they did. But I wasn't empathetic to the point of not having them prosecuted. And I would think a cop would not, like, what?
Yeah.
That didn't really. So that's where I got composite of a lot of characters, because even if that was a piece of one person's thing, it wasn't congruent with the rest of her character. Because the whole time she's like, we got to bring him in. We got to question him. We got to, and then all of a sudden she has one conversation with one kid.
Yeah.
And she's going to be like, I'll give him my badge to have her not prosecuted. And, it didn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah. There were some plot holes, if you will, in some of that didn't add up. But I think maybe they just added for dramatic quality, I guess.
I think at the cost of character congruity to me.
Yeah.
And so maybe the creator just got, or the adapter, or whatever you want to call it, got caught up in trying to have so much in there that it got a little bit like, okay, I'd rather just have congruent characters doing, with what people do, which they're usually congruent to their character. You're going to have to give me a really compelling reason if you're going to throw somebody off the ledge like that.
Well, and there was a lot of quote unquote main characters in this film too, which I think made it hard, because there were 4 or 5 kids who all had a pretty deep storyline. Some of them not till later in the series.
Sure.
Then you have the detective, you have the writer, you have the detective's father, you have the brother who's passed away. It's like they tried to attack everything from a level of such depth that I understand that they needed something to like build a story around, like you were saying earlier, but almost to the cost of like, they could have spent more time, I think, on Kelly Ellard's character. They could have spent more time on the parents, where it's like, to me, those were real people. And as much as I was very captivated by the series, knowing that now some of these characters didn't even exist, it's like, okay, I understand having them there, but at what cost are we then leaving out other really important pieces that they could have spent more time? I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the key part of this, and I'll just say, like, the important thing that I think they were trying to do, at least it sounds like that from the article, which I really appreciate, is that if you're a Canadian, you'll have a lot more information about this than I will. But my understanding is that there was a long period of time, and it still happens, where the government took kids away from Native families and had them fostered with white families. It was originally, I imagine, well-intentioned, but it went very, very badly very quickly.
I liked Lily Gladstone's storyline. I did like that cultural component, and I liked her. If this was not a true story, right? If the whole thing wasn't a true story and this was just a made-up series, I liked her storyline a lot. But knowing that her character didn't even exist,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly for this representation. So it's a pretty, from my knowledge, which is brief, it's a pretty dark part of Canadian history that a lot of politicians don't bring up, don't address. The intent was basically like our child protective services, their child services. There were people involved where originally the idea was to help First Nations families who were, let's say one of the parents was taking a lot of drugs and the kid is born on drugs, or there was a lot of the same kinds of issues we deal with in this country for child protective services. And what ended up happening, unfortunately, is that then there were a lot of people involved that would take kids away that didn't need to be taken away.
Yeah.
So it was an oppression. It's an awful dark part of how they treat First Nations people.
Sure.
In America, if you are American, our Native American culture is very oppressed and are being wiped out and taken out of our legislation in all different parts of this country. And we are all sitting on Indigenous lands. My understanding and my learning of Canadian history and also Canada currently is that the First Nations people are a much bigger part of Canadian culture, even to this day, than our Native Americans are. It's just very different.
Yeah.
And so I can see how, as a Canadian product, this series is going to address these atrocities that happen with that. And they do it with this character.
Sure.
So that makes me understand why they made up the character and put it in and gave him the story and everything. But also, I still agree with myself and with you that it's a little bit fucked up.
Yeah.
It just doesn't quite make sense.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Kelly Ellard, who was charged with second-degree murder following Virk's death. So she was tried as an adult in March of 2000. British Columbia Court of Appeals overturned the conviction in 2003. And then there was a second trial in 2004. This took a long time. And then that led the judge to rule a mistrial. And then there was a third trial, and she was convicted again in April 2005, and then finally sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 7 years, according to the documents. However, in Canada, they have something called day parole. I don't know if this exists here or if it's called something else, because I remember when we studied, it was either the Night Stalker or Dahmer, that one of them had been in prison and were let out to do work during the day. So day parole is a form of conditional release where they're not in like a halfway house, or they're not in a conditional release program. They're actually still in prison, but they get released during the day and they're able to participate in public activities before returning to prison or a halfway house at night. She, I believe, goes back to prison. And then the Parole Board of Canada has been extending Ellard's day parole in 6-month increments. So they kind of revisit it every 6 months to see. She ends up having kids. So she's 41 years old. She gave birth to her first child while in prison, and then gave birth to her second child while on day parole in 2020. She was fairly young when she committed this crime, and she, if watching the series, vehemently denied. And again, this young woman who plays her, and the part where she goes off about, I did not kill Rita.
And that really happened actually from this woman's diary from watching the trial.
I get chills talking about it because the actress, I keep saying the actress, let me look up her name, or if you can look it up for me, because she's so outstanding that there's this cringy moment where she goes off, and even her face is like she's having this manic episode, which is just pure, narcissistic rage.
Yeah.
But it's really frightening, and she does this really well. And it isn't until many, many, many years later that she does confess.
Yeah. 2016, apparently.
Yeah, 2016. And then I believe that her family believed her, and if her family was anything like the parents that were portrayed in the series,
right,
mother was a huge enabler.
Yeah.
And dad was just kind of there.
Her name is Izzy G.
Izzy G. She was awesome in this. Like, you hated her.
Yeah, you did.
But to think like she did this horrific thing, and now she's been allowed to have pretty normal life, except she has to sleep in jail,
Yeah, my understanding is that life in prison is not life in prison in Canada.
Yeah. And so
so a lot of them get off. Like Warren gets off eventually, even though he was sentenced to life.
Yeah, he gets off. Not to move into my work or anything, but to just think about, like, I wonder what sort of rehabilitation, if possible, happens because of that versus like our system where it's just punishment based. But she also seemed like Warren seemed, at least the way that the characters were, positioned in this series, Warren looks like he could have profited from experience and reflection, whatever. Not really sure about Kelly.
Yeah, not really sure about Kelly for sure.
Yeah.
An interesting thing about Warren is that isn't really concentrated on, and you don't get the context of it in the series, is, how in this series there's that conversation between him and the victim's mother.
Yeah.
The real Warren actually participated in a restorative justice program while in prison. Okay. And that's how that, they collapse time as we do in any kind of true story. That happened years later, basically. Like, they make it so it happened like right away practically in the series because he's a young kid and everything. But he participated in a restorative justice. So there was remorse. All the things that are portrayed in the series were real as far as we know or can tell.
To use that form of restorative justice with the psychopath would have just been offensive to the parents. But to someone who could reflect and have empathy, it can be very empowering.
Yeah. And so he was, went up for parole in 2007, and he was released, and parole board was in support. He got an apartment. He was going to school. It was difficult, obviously, for him, but those are sort of some of the things, I guess, that he did to repair his own guilt and whatever over the situation.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
The British accent thing
in
the series, that whole moment is actually taken from the book and Rebecca's notes, and it talks about how Kelly told her story of the evening. As she spoke, her voice took on a clipped, precise tone, both prim and concise, and occasionally it seemed as if she was using a British accent. So whereas the actress decided to actually use a British accent, that's the description of what Rebecca actually witnessed on the stand. And it seemed then that Kelly must have stood up, though she seemed seated. Like it's like probably leaning forward and getting taller. And yet her voice was so loud and forceful as she screamed, "I did not kill Reena Virk, and I will repeat it, and I will stick with that until the day I die. I don't care how much jail time I do. I did not kill Reena Virk. I will still say I did not kill Reena Virk until the day I die. I don't care if I get another life sentence, but I did not kill Reena Virk." And she's like yelling and all that.
Yeah, that was a powerful scene.
It was.
You're
just she's a total psychopath.
Yeah, you're like, oh God, this girl's evil.
Yeah, and one of the things they did is, it's called the Shoreline Six, but there weren't six in the series. They left out two of the people. So there were actually six kids that were involved. And one of the things actually that I wanted to mention that I thought was interesting is that they also left out that there were 4 teenagers that came forward about the murder. So in the series, they don't really do that. They have like a reluctant Warren's girlfriend that gets interrogated and gives up the goods or whatever. And it makes it seem like it's this pivotal moment. But one of the things that actually happened is that there were teens that came forward with details about that night. There were these 2 brave teenagers that said something after like learning of the murder. That was kind of one of the big reasons why, these people were convicted. There were even 2 of these teens were even, I think, sisters, and they were the people that actually suggested to the police to search the water. Because at that point, they didn't even know. So that's left out, which I think is unfortunate because it could have been really redeeming for the teen culture in this movie that 4 of the teens that were at the party under the bridge actually came forward with a lot of details and really helped.
Yeah, that's a big difference because there were a lot of kids surrounding.
Tons, right? Yeah. It was a party. And they really just wanted to, I guess, hone in on the bullying, but it could have been really interesting and redemptive to show that there were teens that were very much about helping.
Yeah.
Also, here's another piece that I learned. Reena's relationship, which is the kid that Cam ultimately tries to defend and sort of says that like she's portrayed as the one kid that's remorseful basically, and Cam, the police officer, tries to get her off and leans into that a little bit. An interesting thing is that character dated Dusty's ex-boyfriend or something, like one of the other characters. And so that actually played a big part in the involvement of the attack. There's all these little interesting details. And this is always what I want to say about true stories or documentaries or anything. The way the story is crafted has an agenda.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And not trying to convolute everything.
Right.
But there's all these little bits and pieces where in the real story, it's different, right? The dynamics are different. The motivations are different.
For sure. Yeah.
And, Kelly Ellard was actually referred for a school transfer at one point in the school.
Prior to all of this?
Yeah, she had a long history of, this is where we get into our soapbox, right? She had displayed, the quote I saw was, a disturbing pattern of violence.
Well, and this is where, and I talked about this on
privilege
on like when I've talked about threat before.
Yeah.
And Gavin DeBecker's work around like people don't snap overnight. And we have usually a lot of like precursors we ignore and continue to give people the benefit of the doubt, especially if they're white and a female at that time, even more so than now, that she was, kept being given chances or they kind of move her over here or whatever. And it's like, dude.
Yeah. And the judge really portrays her like this is a kid with good grades and a pristine record. And there was a documented pattern. It was not an isolated event. There was a document pattern. She had been hostile and aggressive long before the attack. There was even a guidance counselor that put her in for a school transfer that was denied. There was all this stuff. Like, this is just that thing where it's like, things can be seen. We've talked about this with risk assessment. Kathy's talked about this in the community here in Los Angeles. And how can we have a team that's better at risk assessment and seeing these things before they happen and trying to be proactive instead of just reactive. This is one of those situations where certainly in my work and what we've talked about in general is, kids being seen and the privilege of who she was with a good support system, that she couldn't be responsible for this. I thought it was interesting too, that this boy, Warren, he tells the truth and gets life. She lies and gets 5 years. And I just thought that was so fascinating.
Well, so this is court hacks that people will use too, is the order in which people are tried, right? So like Warren had, not only did he have some of these demographics that made him more susceptible to being seen as a delinquent, right? So his parents weren't around. He was a boy. He was, just the demographics just go against him naturally to be violent compared to her, where they testified the hell out of him. He had no family supporting him. He probably didn't have the same type of representation. So they exploited I think his socioeconomic status, made him go first. And then by the time Kelly got up there was already so much put into Warren's guilt that I think they were hoping to use that partially as a strategy. And then she also, as a female, and then her parents being enabling and probably hiring like this really, at least how they portrayed it in the series, was this attorney was, totally believed her and was like saying some shit while he was up there to manipulate the jury. I just think there were a lot of things going against Warren at that time. We as a society now look at justice a little bit differently and we understand it. But I think at that time it was like, he's the more obvious choice and we need to feel sorry for this girl. And so I think they did a couple of strategic court hacks to make her not stand out as much.
Yeah, and it's Canadian government too, so we don't know as much about that as we do about American justice system, but I can tell you that it's documented that they interrogated him after he asked for a lawyer.
Yeah.
And that is also a violation in Canada.
Well, and if you have no parents and nobody around, who's he going to tell? Who's going to stick up for him? Where she was completely protected.
Interesting stuff. So there's lots and lots of details and different things like this about it. If you want to watch the series, I think we both still recommend it, but it's I would say like mid for me. The real story, the difference is probably the book. I haven't read the book, probably more interesting, but it has been interesting to look at a Canadian case like this. And the series is critically acclaimed. I think we're finding some things we didn't particularly like about it, but I think it's a solid watch if you would like to understand the bullying that happened, if that's something you're processing within yourself. And there's a lot of good acting. That is undeniable. So
for sure.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Terror Talk. My name is Shannon.
And I'm Kathy. Sleep safe, everyone.